before we can actually get into the text, what we need to do is look at the genre of the text of Genesis. This was seen by the ICBI, the International Council of Biblical Inerrancy. Back in the 70s, they wrote the first document about the document of inerrancy. Then within 4 years, they wrote the document on hermeneutics. Because people would say, I'm not denying what Scripture is teaching. What I'm denying is that that's the genre of that particular book or chapter or verse. So there's two ways to deny that the Bible is teaching something. You can go outright and just say, that says X, and I don't believe X is true. Or you can say that says X, but that's in a specific genre of literature, and that genre doesn't really mean X. Now, of course, we would all agree with genre criticism, right? There's certain genres throughout the Bible. There's poetry, there's prose, there's epistle, there's apocalyptic, there's a biography, there's a prophecy, there's history. There's all sorts of different genres. But if you get the wrong genre, you're going to be effectively denying what the text is trying to say. Are you with me? All right. To begin, the newest view on the genre of Genesis that has come under a lot of scrutiny and has really hit the evangelical world in a severe way is the view of William Lane Craig in his book, In Quest of the Historical Adam. He holds that the genre of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, is in a genre called mytho-history. Not history, not mythology, mytho-history. What that means is that the genre of Genesis is interested in history. He believes in an original human pair from whom the entire human race sprung. He believes in a literal Adam and Eve. However, he also believes that Genesis 1 through 11 is explained with the language of myth and fantastic imagery. And, we could get into, was there a flood? Craig would say, probably. How long did the antediluvians live? He would say, well, surely not 910 years. That's mythology. But were there genealogies, and were those persons in the genealogies real? He would say, of course, that's history. Was there an Adam and Eve? Yes. Was there a talking serpent? No. That's fantastic. Was God walking in the cool of the garden? No. Were there a tree that has the knowledge of good and evil? No. This is all fantastic imagery, and that's the mythological component. Well, you could see that is a big change from what most of us have taught and have read in the past. That's his assertion. His assertion is that this is in the genre of mytho-history. What is the argument? What is the evidence for that assertion? All right, he made an assertion. What's the evidence? Well, he gives 10 different family resemblances between Genesis 1 through 11 and other ancient Near Eastern literature. So just like if you were looking at games, different types of games, board games or basketball games or different card games, it'd be hard to say that all of those games have all the same criteria, but you could classify all of them as games. And so the same thing is true here as well. Craig would say that if you look at all of these different family resemblances in the ancient Near Eastern myths, they line up like a hand and a glove with Genesis. He says that there's 10 of these, and 8 out of the 10 match with Genesis. So that's pretty compelling. If the genre is that close to other ancient Near Eastern myths, that would be compelling. Here are the 10 criteria. Criterion number 1. Myths are narratives, whether oral or literary. That is exceptionally broad. That is so broad you could drive a Mack truck through it. That describes all literature. Number 2, myths are traditional stories handed down from generation to generation. This is the view of Genesis, that there was a bunch of sources behind the text that were compiled and put together that these were orally transmitted for centuries, and eventually were stitched together by an author-editor sometime in, 900 BC all the way to 450 BC. This is what's called the JEDP theory, or the Wellhausen hypothesis. Now, in Genesis, there is no D. There is no Deuteronomistic. There is no Deuteronomist in Genesis. But there is the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the priestly source in Genesis. Craig is favorable to the JEDP theory. He doesn't say that it's true. He says that everyone and their brother believes this in Old Testament studies, and he follows it throughout his book, and he says, I'm not going to take a stance on it, but I'm going to deal with the canonical text. But this is one of his criteria for myth, is that these stories were handed down. We have no evidence that the compilation of Genesis was handed down through generations. Zero. There is zero evidence for that. We've never found the J source, or the E source, or the P source. Doesn't exist. What we do have is, throughout the Bible, many mentions of Moses spending lots of time with God. And Moses speaking with God over weeks. And Moses going into the tabernacle and his face lighting up, and he has to put the veil over it. In Exodus 17, he has to write it down in a book. Exodus 24, he writes it down in the book. And Joshua writes it down in the... It's written by Moses, who had all of the education of the Egyptians, according to Acts 7:22. So the evidence that we have is not that it was handed down from generation to generation. Moreover, let me explore this a little bit. How could you have generational data, these oral traditions, that go all the way back to Adam and Eve? Obviously, you can't. Obviously, you can't. So what is this saying? That these are sacred narratives that were being built by the community of the Jews that go back hundreds of years from the time of Jesus. So we're not off to a good start. Criterion number 1, that fits anything. Criterion number 2, I don't believe in this. I don't think there's good evidence for it. Even if it was true, that would actually preclude the fact that this goes back to Adam and Eve. You can't get around divine revelation. Number 3, myths are sacred for the society that embraces them. Myths are object of belief by members of the society that embraces them. This is exceptionally broad. Any religious literature is going to be sacred for that society, and any religious literature is going to be believed by the people in that society. 5, myths are set in a primeval and ancient age or another realm. Well, yeah, they are from an ancient age. We agree with that because we're talking about the origins of the universe and life and culture and the fall and everything. But what about that idea that it's from another realm? Doesn't fit with Genesis 1 through 11. Even Genesis 2, which is the most highly contested for our suitabilities here. Genesis 2 says that Adam was in a garden in Eden. And it goes to great lengths to describe the geographical boundaries of that garden. The Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. It gives us geography. Then once you get out of the garden, you go to the east, then you go to the land of Nod. There's all these geographical descriptors. This is describing what's happening in our world. It isn't happening in some other world that we don't understand it at all. 6, myths are stories in which deities are important characters. Deities, plural. Now, Craig says, well, there's only one God in Genesis 1 through 11, but this fits this criterion. Why? Because if you have one deity, at least that fits under the general rubric of deities. No, I mean, logically that's true. But for our purposes, that is so misleading. That would be like me saying to someone who is a polyamorous or a polygamist, a man who has 8 wives, and I have 1 wife. Well, we're both married, so we're both essentially the same. We're both married. No, the biblical worldview in belief in one single transcendent deity is night and day different from the ancient Near Eastern mythologies of a plurality of deities that arise from matter rather than giving birth to matter and energy. 7, myths seek to answer present realities. such as the world, mankind, natural phenomena, cultural practices, and the prevailing cults, which is Latin for a worship, in a primordial ancient time? Well, of course they do. If you're writing a creation story, of course it's going to be about the origin of the world, the origin of humans, the origin of natural phenomena like the sun, the moon, and the stars, and ecology and so forth. Cultural practices, where did those come from? And where you got your worship. If you and I were both writing a report on Martin Luther King Jr., would there be overlap on that subject matter? Well, of course there would, because we're both writing about the same subject. This criterion fails. Number 8, myths are associated with rituals. That's all religion. All religion is associated with ritual. Study religion. Biblical Christianity sticks out like a sore thumb. 2 rituals. Baptism, which you only do once, and the Lord's Supper, which you do as much as you want. Every other religion, tons of rituals. This is religion. Number 9, myths express correspondences between the deities and nature. Again, deities plural, and nature. In the opening chapters of Genesis, what we see is that there is a singular God who is transcendent of nature. He is not having, now, if it means corresponding to nature in the sense that he interacts with it, that he's also immanent, well, sure, but that there's deities corresponding with nature. In the ancient Near Eastern myths, the mythopoetic or mythopoeic idea was that the deities are under every rock and behind every tree. But in the Genesis narrative, what we see is something totally unique. Finally, number 10, myths exhibit fantastic elements and are not troubled by logical contradiction or incoherence. I'm not going to labor this point, but this is highly debated. Let me give you one example. Craig cites Genesis 3, that God is walking in the cool of the garden, Genesis 3:8. He says that is a gross anthropomorphic picture of God compared to what we see in Genesis 1. The transcendent Elohim who just with a word speaks and creation comes into line. But here we've got a God who's walking. We've got a God, in his words, doing CPR on the first human in Genesis 2, bringing him to life, performing a surgery on his side with his rib. That's such a gross, it's almost like a polytheistic deity. No, it's a theophany. Theos meaning God and phanero meaning to reveal, a revelation of God. Guess where else we see theophanies exactly like this? All throughout the Bible. We see this in Genesis 18, where God appeared to Abraham. Abraham fed him bread. Abraham washed his feet. It says the Lord Yahweh spoke to Abraham. Same book, just several chapters later. Another would be the talking serpent. The talking serpent, yeah. There's views on this. One view is that a serpent is possessed by Satan. You say, well, I don't know, that seems kind of extreme. Why is that extreme? We're supernaturalists. We believe that demons can go into pigs. We believe that, right? Yeah, remember the story in the Gospels where it goes in the pigs, they go off to the edge? Demons can go into people. They can incarnate people. Why can't they go into serpents? Where do we draw the line? So too, other people say, well, the serpent is actually just a picture of the serpent, the Nagash. That's a word used in occult practice. So he's not just like one of the beasts of the field. He's actually a unique figure. And there's clues in the text, that would be Walter Kaiser's view, that this is actually a personification of Satan. Either way you look at it, you have to deal with Revelation 12:9 and Revelation 20, verse 2, which says, the serpent of old, the devil, Satan. The serpent, the devil of old, Satan, is clearly referring to the serpent as Satan. And yet Greg says, no, that's a fantastic element. I mean, we could go through these one by one. I don't think it'd be very productive. I'm going to say this. Out of the 10 family resemblances, I'm going to give him a 0.5. 0.5 out of 1. So I'm going to give him a 5%. I don't think any of these criteria are sufficient. If you accept these criteria for a genre analysis, Just wait for the next genre analysis that comes out. Well, these are literary, well, these are accepted by the community, and so therefore none of it happened. Or let me go one further. If you accept this genre analysis, that these are similar to the ancient Near Eastern myths, do we know that the author of Genesis was using the same fidelity to truth that the Babylonians, Sumerians, and the Egyptians were using? So newspaper writers would write in a certain genre, but some could be more honest than others. Same genre, but different people. Is the author of Genesis committed to telling the truth in a factual, and I mean a truth in the sense of corresponding to reality? So even if the genre analysis is true, which I don't believe, you would still have to say that the author was willing to adopt that view and not hold to a correspondence view of truth. All right, Craig is not an Old Testament scholar. I don't believe he speaks Hebrew. He studies like a maniac. I mean, the guy is brilliant. And let me be quick to say, William Lane Craig is the GOAT, okay? He's the greatest of all time. He's my personal hero. I don't know, there's very few people that have impacted me as much as him. Very few. I'm talking like 3. I mean, I look up to him so much. I'm just saying he's wrong on this, okay? I love the guy. I wish him well. I'm just saying he's not right about this. Okay. What do Old Testament scholars who are experts in this field have to say about the genre of Genesis? James Offmeyer, he's an Egyptologist. He says, while the text uses various literary genres, the general tenor of the book, and Genesis 1 through 11 in particular, is intended to be thought of as describing real events. John Collins, Genesis is a, quote, historical account, by which he means that the author wanted his audience to believe that the events recorded really happened. He considers Genesis 1 to be exalted prose narrative and Genesis 2 and 3 to be normal prose narrative. I can see what he's saying. There's something unique in Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, isn't there? There was evening and there was morning the first day, evening and morning the second day. There's ordinal numbers, there's days. There's something unique in Genesis 1. So many people have said Genesis is poetry. Okay, let's say Genesis 1 is poetry. It isn't. But let's say Genesis 1 is poetry. Genesis 2, 4, and following are, quote, normal prose narrative. So even if you want to hold that there's a literary framework to Genesis 1, cool. If you want to hold that it's poetry, cool. But how do you get past Genesis 2? Genesis 2 is clearly prose narrative, like we see throughout the rest of the scriptures. Collins says there must be some sense in which the faithful are to regard this as the true telling of the world's story. This is in his review of Craig's book. As over against the alternative tellings found among both the unfaithful in Israel and the wider Gentile world. You see what he's saying? There has to be some way where the faithful know this is being told truthfully compared to the Gentile world, ancient Near Eastern myth. Craig will say that the classification of mythohistory will accomplish this, does this work. However, Collins says, I agree that it aims to do so, but I think it renders some of the necessary details invisible. Read Collins' work. What you see is he's like, no, that's not an imaginary snake. No, that's not fantastic. No, it's not God performing CPR. Collins is a very diplomatic, ironic scholar. I really like his writing. He's being very gentle here. He's saying you're whitewashing the text with this mytho-history genre. And the part about this that is troublesome is that Craig will consistently say, I'm just saying the same thing that Jack Collins is saying. No, you are not. Jack Collins is not in agreement on this. What about Derek Kidner? These guidelines exclude the idea of myth and assure us that we are reading of actual pivotal events. Oswald, he says, I think Craig wants to say that Genesis 1 through 11 is history with myth-like characteristics. That was not at all Thornkild Jacobson. He's the guy who invented mythohistory. He was an Assyriologist in the 20th century. He said that was not Jacobson's interest. He believed, Jacobson, that Genesis was a, quote, false tale of the gods, just like the Sumerian writings are. Jacobson, this Assyriologist, was looking at the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian Genesis, and the biblical Genesis, and he was comparing the two, and he's like, yeah, they're both fiction. Neither of these are true. So, Oswalt says, mytho-history is an oxymoron. Now, he goes a little bit farther than I would in this critique. All right, I don't think I would go that far as to say mytho-history is an oxymoron, because Craig is adamant, no, there is history, that Adam and Eve are real, the genealogies are of real people, etc., etc. However, I would say, of all the scholars I'm citing, John Oswalt is probably the most credible to critique this. He wrote the book, The Bible Among the Myths. He is an expert on ancient Near Eastern mythology. What about Gordon Wenham? Here are the big three scholars on Genesis. Gordon Wenham, Victor Hamilton, and Kenneth Matthews. These are the top scholars on Genesis. Here we go. Genesis, the genre, is proto-history. It is proto in that it describes origins, what happened first. It is also proto in that it is setting out models of God and his dealings with the human race. It is historical in that it is describing past realities and the lessons that should be drawn from them. Past realities, yeah. Calling Genesis 1 through 11 myth is at least unwise, at worst misleading, and, as I shall argue, inaccurate. Genesis 1 through 11, quote, were viewed as real events. We all hold that these narratives reflect real events, even if they're not in the style of a 21st century journalist or historian. Yeah, that would be totally anachronistic to say that this needs to be written like a modern history. But he's saying they're real events. Again, Craig would say, I'm saying nothing different than Gordon Wenham. Yes, you are. Gordon Wenham does not agree on this. He says the first hearers would doubtless have held them in similar respect, catch this, to our era's respect for modern cosmologies or other scientific theories. For these reasons, it is prudent to avoid the term myth in describing the genre of Genesis 1 through 11. Victor Hamilton, it is irresponsible and incorrect to speak of these stories as myth on those bases. The worldview of Genesis 1 through 11, with its articulation of God, nature, and ethical choices, transcends the worldview of the mythopoeic mind. To say all this, of course, says nothing about the truthfulness or falsehood of these stories. It claims only that they are non-mythic. He's not saying you need to believe that these are true. It's that they're intended to be true. Authorial intent. Finally, here's the third one, Matthews. His commentary. Excellent. I'm on chapter 40 in my personal time. This guy is my Elvis. I love him. There is no myth comparable to the literary composition of Genesis 1 through 11. There are pieces, but close examination shows that the biblical handling of even those subjects is so uniquely sculpted that it is hard to justify a true parallel. Instead of borrowing or historicizing of ancient myth, that's the mytho-history view. You're adding history to myth or telling history through the vehicle of mythology. It is fair to say that Genesis comes closer to a repudiation of pagan ideas about origins, mankind, civilization, and the flood. If there is a mythological element in Genesis's creation, it is best taken as a repudiation of myth, not an adaptation. The creation narrative claims historicity. What about the report from the Presbyterian Assembly? This was a culmination of 2 years of scholarly research in the entire, I don't know what you call it, Synod, Presbyterian Church of America. And they came together, and at the end of the study, they said, we believe that history, not myth, is the proper category for describing these chapters. And furthermore, that history is true. The Chicago Statement. 313 of the top evangelical scholars in the world. Like who? Like everybody. Gleason Archer, D.A. Carson, J.P. Moreland, Norm Geisler, Paul Feinberg, John Feinberg. I mean, everybody who is anybody. Just to give you an idea, D.A. Carson has the entire New Testament memorized in Greek. Okay? Gleason Archer spoke 20 dead languages. These are the kind of people in the International Council of Biblical Inerrancy. They signed this, and they said one of the affirmations was that Genesis 1 through 11 is factual, as is the rest of the book. We deny that the teachings of Genesis 1 through 11 are mythical. So, to summarize, Genesis 1 through 11 is in the genre of historical prose narrative.